1 Corinthians chapter 3 continues Paul's discussion about unity, calling the believers in the church in Corinth to be unified. In chapter 3, he has a pretty strong tone. You can hear almost some irritation, perhaps, in his voice. It starts, "Brothers and sisters, I could not address you as people who live by the Spirit, but as people who are still worldly, mere infants in Christ." He talked in chapter 2 about how they all have the Spirit of God. They all have available to them the ability to discern and understand what is important to God. But he's saying, you're not acting like people who have the Spirit. And as a father talking to his children, this heart of discipline is coming through. He said, "I gave you milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. Indeed, you are still not ready, for you are still worldly. For there is jealousy and quarreling among you. Since there's those things, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans?" He's saying you're acting like regular people right now, instead of like people who have the Spirit of God. The Greek in there, it maybe would be translated, you're acting fleshly instead of spiritual, sarkanos instead of pneumatikos. You're acting like people who operate from the flesh instead of people who operate by the Spirit. And so this is fascinating because, as we talked about last time, we all as believers have access to this Spirit of God to be able to understand the deepest, innermost values and ideas about God. Yet it appears we also have the choice to not listen to that, to listen to our fleshly impulses, to think about things in worldly ways. And he's rebuking them for operating in that way. He's saying, when one of you says, "I follow Paul," and another, "I follow Apollos," are you not mere human beings? This kind of division and competition is normal for humans. If we look around our own cultural context, if we look through the history of the world, competition, war, division, that is the natural direction that things take in life. When we are divided among us, we're doing the very thing people have been doing since all of history. Even back to the book of Genesis, the first family, one brother, Cain, kills another brother, Abel. The competition, the envy, the jealousy that Cain had towards Abel resulted in him taking Abel's life. And this is the human condition. This is the natural state of things. So people with the Spirit should not compete with each other and divide over these types of things. Now, here the argument goes into a discussion of how God does use human teachers in the process. Up till now, we could maybe get the idea that Paul says it really doesn't matter at all who does what, Paul, Apollos, whatever. And he has wanted to make that point come through the strongest. But he says, well, let's talk about, after all, what Paul and Apollos are. What is Apollos? What is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe. And the Lord has assigned to each his task. I had a task, Apollos had a task, and it was our job to do our task. And then he goes on to say, I planted the seed and Apollos watered it, but God is the one that's been making it grow. So he uses an analogy from nature. And even in our own modern time, there's a bit of a mystery to the idea that we plant a seed, we water it, and somehow it grows. A seed, if it's kept dry and safe, can last for years and years and years, but then once it's planted and watered, it begins to grow. Almost miraculously, it looks like. This is the way it works when a person is converted and grows in Christ. Sure, I, Paul, planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but no one of us could really make it grow. Much like the natural world of planting and growing plants, there are conditions required. There is a certain participation that humans are involved in, but yet it is a work of God. And so my job was to plant. My job was to lay a foundation. It says in verse 10, by the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should build with care. So now he switches the analogy from planting to building a building. He said, my job was to be a foundation layer. Someone else comes and builds upon it. And he says we need to be careful because there's no foundation you can build on except for the message of Christ. Developing this analogy in the verses that follow, he says maybe someone builds with various types of elements. There's gold, silver, costly stone, wood, hay, or straw. And he says in verse 13, their work will be shown for what it is because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it is burned up, the builder will suffer loss, but yet will be saved, even though only as one escaping through the flames. So he says, in this life, we can only do our best to build with care, to serve and teach and grow in a way that seems faithful. But ultimately, God will be the one to assess each person's work. He's basically saying, you could look at Paul and Apollos and think, wow, these are special people. They each did something amazing in our community. But he's saying none of us can even really know what God's assessment is until the end. And he uses this sort of ominous image of fire, a fire not of judgment, but of testing. Let's see if what you built has some durability to it. Let's see if the materials you used can withstand this type of scrutiny. And he says that if someone builds on something other than Christ, that all of that work will be burned up. They themselves will survive. He's saying they'll come out like someone who just escaped the flames. Maybe their clothes will be singed. They'll have a smell of smoke on them, but they're alive. But he's saying, wouldn't that be a shame to live a lifetime, and have nothing to show for it because it wasn't founded on the work of Christ? C.T. Studd wrote a poem, and one line in there has stuck with me for years. Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. And I think that's what Paul's getting at here, that I don't even know if my work is going to withstand testing. He'll describe this dynamic in chapter 4 as well. We'll get to that, where he says, I can't even know for myself if what I'm doing is pleasing God. I can do my best, but ultimately God is the judge. He will be the one that assesses. So it's a bit of an ominous way to describe it, that we could be going on for years and years and realize that eventually that our life has been a waste. But he's saying, if you think about us human leaders, myself, Apollos, in this kind of competitive way, you're missing the whole arrangement that God has built here in how he chooses to use his servants. My job was to lay a foundation, someone else builds. God will show on the final day who's done a good job, who has good motives, who has done things in a way that please him, and who hasn't. And so, again, there's something kind of humbling about this, that we don't even know what God's point of view is. Perhaps we could look at some prominent pastor or successful author and think, wow, they must really be favored by God. But God could know that in their hearts they were doing it from selfish motives, or that there was hidden immorality in their life, or some other attitude or disposition that displeases him. And he's going to say, look, I'm using you because I have a bigger agenda than you. I'm using you in spite of yourself. And someday, maybe there will be someone who we never have heard of, who served God in obscurity for years and years, but were doing it faithfully, building on the foundation of Christ, doing it with hearts and minds that were devoted to God, and they will be honored as faithful servants of God. And we don't know. And Paul's point is, that's not our job to know. Our job is to be faithful to whatever work we have been entrusted with. And so again, tracing the argument from chapter 1, calling them to unity, the things they are choosing to divide over, human leaders, these types of affiliations with some person they consider prominent or important. He's saying, look, we're all just each doing our part, and you should be sure you're doing your part. You should be ensuring that your life is committed to things that will withstand God's assessment on the day, the final judgment. And as he will bring out later in chapter 15, this vision of the end helps inform the present. It can help us to see how we ought to live today when we remember that we're going to meet God someday. And I don't want this to inspire fear in you of condemnation, not the fear of judgment and condemnation. Romans 8, there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. But I do want you to worry that you might be wasting your life. I do want you to wonder, what I'm doing going to withstand the day of God's assessment? Or have I been devoting myself to things that are only superficial and mere human achievements? He said at the beginning, don't act like mere humans. Well, don't devote yourself to merely human accomplishment. Devote yourself to the building up of God's kingdom. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, for God's temple is sacred and you together are that temple. So he's saying when you're not unified or when you're investing your life in something other than the things of God, you are disintegrating, you are dividing God's temple. And that is something that bothers God deeply. It makes me think of when Jesus cleansed the temple in John 2, and it says that his disciples later remembered the verse, "Zeal for your house will consume me." That kind of passion that Jesus had, that the temple of God would be a place of prayer and of worship and dedication to him, whereas they had turned it into a market. That kind of zeal comes through in these words that Paul is saying, that we should be passionate about doing the work of God. And so maybe you're successful in the workplace, maybe you are influential in your community based on your personality in gifts. But this is a reminder, God is watching. And God is ultimately the one who will assess if that was worth your time and energy or not. And so no fear of condemnation here, but truly a call to assess and to question ourselves. And again, when in the spirit of this discussion about unity, that helps us get our eyes off of someone else to compare and compete and just says, I want to make sure that I'm ready for God's assessment. He says in verse 18, do not deceive yourselves. If any of you think you are wise by human standards of this age, you should become fools so that you may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows that the thoughts of the wise are futile. So then no more boasting about human leaders. All things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours, and you are of Christ, and Christ is of God. So he's saying, if you think you're wise and accomplished by human standards, you should humble yourself. You should become a fool in the eyes of the world. It's like Jesus says in Matthew chapter 18. He said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. He's talking to his disciples. He's talking to people who might look prominent and successful in the world around him. And he's saying, you need faith like a child. Humble yourself. Make yourself lowly. Don't see yourself as great because you've done something that the world considers valuable. Consider what God cares about. And frankly, he says, there's no reason to boast about these leaders because we're all in this together. You have Paul, you have Apollos, you have Cephas. You don't need to pick one over the other. We're all in this together. And we all should have a certain reverent awe at the reality that someday God will say, what was your life dedicated to? Was it dedicated to things that I care about? You had my Spirit. You had the testimony of Christ. Chapter 2, chapter 1, we covered those things. What are you doing with it? Paul's job was to plant. Apollos' job was to water. What's your job? Maybe it's to plant, maybe it's to water. We build on the foundation of Christ, and someday God will assess it. So I invite you to assess your own motives, your own heart, your own dedication of time and energy. Is it going to be shown to be worthwhile in the end? Or is it merely human accomplishments? What a sad thought to spend a lifetime in Christ as his beloved child, yet wasting years and years that he's given us. Every day is an opportunity to invest in the things of God. Let's consider what God has given us to do. Let's get our eyes off of what he's called someone else to do. You do your job. I'll do my job. We each do our job. And God is the one who will say, well done, good and faithful servant.